Okay, so for today's class, we're going to be looking at the endocrine system. And to do that, I'd like to do a quick comparison, comparing the neural system to the endocrine system. Because when we talk about control centers and a system that controls and coordinates bodily functions, I think of the neural system. But the endocrine system, its close cousin, also does the same thing. They work synergistically together to coordinate all of the systems of the body, both neural and endocrine. The neural system is releasing a chemical messenger known as neurotransmitters, and the endocrine system releases hormones, another chemical messenger. Most hormones are going to circulate through the blood, and it's going to bind to a receptor on the target cell. Neurotransmitters, they too can bind to receptors on target cell. Now, let's contrast endocrine glands to exocrine. So endocrine is going to release its chemical messenger, or its hormone, into the bloodstream, and it's going to move through the blood and find its target. Whereas exocrine is going to secrete their products into ducts. And none of those are hormones. So an exocrine type of secretion can be like your sweat gland. Your sweat gland is referred to as a sudiferous gland. Your oil glands, those are referred to as sebaceous glands. You have mucus glands, you have digestive glands, you have mammary glands. So these are all exocrine. We have some organs that are considered mixed, meaning they have endocrine and exocrine function. And a classical example of a mixed gland is going to be the pancreas. Now, most of us think the pancreas is an endocrine organ that's involved in regulating blood sugar, which is true. If your blood sugar is too high, then the beta cells of the islets of Langerhans will release a hormone called insulin to lower blood sugar. And if you're in a fasting state and you haven't eaten in a while and your blood sugar dips, then the alpha cells of the islets of Langerhans of the pancreas release a hormone called glucagon, which is designed to increase blood sugar. And that glucagon goes to the liver, and it will convert stored glucose, which is called glycogen. It will convert that stored form of glucose, glycogen, back into glucose. Now, endocrine, these are going to secrete hormones. Now, endocrine glands, they don't have ducts like the exocrine. Instead, they're going to secrete their hormone directly into the interstitial fluid that surrounds them. These the hormones can diffuse into your bloodstream to go through your capillaries, and they're going to get carried to a target cell throughout the body. A few examples of endocrine glands. You have the pituitary, which is up in the brain. You have the thyroid, which is in your throat. It's that H-shaped gland. You have the parathyroid that's associated with the thyroid. It's on the posterior portion of the thyroid, on the lateral lobes. We have the adrenal gland and the pineal gland. Pineal is also in the brain. Now we have certain organs and tissues that are not really considered part of the endocrine system, but they're also going to secrete hormones because they have hormone secreting cells. We have a part of the brain called the hypothalamus, which has endocrine function. We have the thymus, which is posterior to your sternum. There's the pancreas, right? Now, I remember I said the pancreas, most people think is endocrine because of insulin and glucagon, but It's mixed because the pancreas also has exocrine function because it is releasing some digestive enzymes from the pancreas directly into the duodenum. There's a connection from the pancreas into the duodenum. And pancreas releases pancreatic lipase, pancreatic carbohydrase, and pancreatic protease. Anything that ends in ase is an enzyme. So if I call it a protease, it's breaking down proteins. Carbohydrase, an enzyme that breaks down carbohydrates. Lipase, an enzyme that breaks down lipids. The ovaries and the testes. When you think of ovaries and testes, you're thinking reproductive. Yes, they are part of the reproductive system, but the ovaries release hormones and so do the testes. The ovaries release estrogen. Testes are involved with testosterone. The kidneys, you're saying the kidneys are an endocrine organ? Yeah, it's not just involved with filtration, but a lot of blood goes through the kidneys and it makes the kidneys the perfect organ to kind of determine, hey, what is the blood pressure like? And hey, what is oxygen levels like? Because remember, red blood cells carry oxygen. So the kidneys can release a hormone or two that is involved with regulating blood pressure and producing more red blood cells if oxygen levels dip. The kidneys are endocrine as well because they're involved with the production of vitamin D, which is cholecalciferol. So we have sunlight, UV rays come down, and it's going to hit the skin, and there is subcutaneous cholesterol on your skin, and it converts that into vitamin D precursors that go to the liver. And the liver is going to hydroxylate that, and then it's going to send it to the kidneys. Okay, and the kidneys hydroxylate it again and produce vitamin D. So to make vitamin D, you need direct sun, you need sunlight, you need cholesterol, you need healthy liver, healthy skin, and healthy kidneys. The stomach produces hormones, the liver, the small intestine, the skin, the heart, fat cells, which is adipose tissue, and even the placenta. So many other parts and organs that are not part of the endocrine system have endocrine function. And that's an important concept to keep in mind. So this is a really, really good picture, and I could probably spend, 30 minutes on just this alone and just have this one picture and go over the entire endocrine system structure and function and hormones and call it a day. But let's go through some of the key concepts here. I just like it because it shows all of the major players in one illustration, and it kind of shows the orientation of it. So if we look up in the brain, we can see there's three main parts in the brain that are part of the endocrine system. Highest up, we have the hypothalamus, right? This right here is the thalamus, and below it is the hypothalamus. And there's a very close, intimate connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary. There's a major connection, actually, between the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and your thyroid. And then there's another major connection between the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenals. We just call it the Hpa axis and the HPT axis. HPT for hypothalamus, pituitary, thyroid. HPA for hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal. They communicate with one another. So your hypothalamus may release or produce a hormone called thyroid releasing hormone. And thyroid releasing hormone is a regulatory hormone that goes to the pituitary, the anterior pituitary, and says, hey, we want you to release thyroid stimulating hormone. And then thyroid stimulating hormone goes to the thyroid and produces thyroxine, which is T4. So it's kind of like dominoes. One releases one hormone, goes to another place and says, hey, you're going to release this one. And then the pituitary says, okay, got the message. I'm going to go to the thyroid and tell it what to do. And then the thyroid releases its hormones, and it has action on different parts of the body. Same thing with the HPA axis between the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal axis, where the hypothalamus can release corticotropic releasing hormone. And that corticotropic releasing hormone from the hypothalamus goes to the pituitary anterior, and there's adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. That's going to go to the adrenal gland, especially to the cortex. You can tell by the name, adrenocortico, cortico for cortex, which is the outer part of the adrenal gland. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is going to go to the adrenal cortex to push out cortisol. So you have, again, another amazing connection between these glands. All right, just to give you a little idea of how they connect with each other. So the hypothalamus produces anti-diuretic hormone, which is ADH, and oxytocin. It produces ADH and oxytocin, but then what you can see is that if you look at the pituitary, especially the posterior lobe, it says it releases oxytocin and ADH. So the hypothalamus produces ADH and oxytocin. It's going to go from the hypothalamus into the pituitary, posterior lobe of it, and store it there. It's going to store oxytocin and ADH in the posterior lobe, and the posterior lobe can release it when it needs to. So you need to know the hormones by their abbreviation, but also what they stand for. That's because on many blood chemistry or on many lab tests, you'll see TSH levels, GH levels, FSH, LH levels, and it's not writing out the whole word, but you have to know LH is luteinizing hormone, and FSH is follicular stimulating hormone, and PRL is prolactin releasing hormone. GH is growth hormone. MSH is melanocyte stimulating hormone. ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. So you have to know what their abbreviations are. So the hypothalamus produces anti-diuretic hormone. So you have to know, well, what's a diuretic? A diuretic is like coffee, alcohol, lots of sugar. Those are all diuretics, and those are all going to make you urinate. Anti-diuretic is going to tell your body to hold on to the water and retain it. And if you're holding on to water, I want you to keep in mind that you're holding on to minerals. Minerals and water go hand in hand. If you're losing water, you're losing minerals. Like sodium is an important mineral. Salt, right? Sodium chloride. You can lose sodium. You can lose potassium, magnesium. These are all important minerals. And in nature, that's what you find in water is minerals. That's why it's called mineral water. So water moves, hits the rocks, pulls minerals out of the rocks, and now we have mineral water. It's not good to consume sterilized water, right? Sterilized water is what we call distilled water, where there's nothing in there but pure H2O. And that's poison. You shouldn't be consuming pure H2O, because when that distilled water goes into your body, guess what it's looking for? It's looking for minerals. Water and minerals go hand in hand, remember? So if you consume water without minerals, guess what it's going to do once the water hits your body? It's going to be leaching minerals. It's going to be pulling out minerals. It's going to pull out calcium. That's a problem. You can lose magnesium. You can lose a lot of minerals. Okay, so that's ADH. Oxytocin. Oxytocin is a really important hormone. It's kind of like a bonding hormone. It helps Ma and the baby bond and connect. That's oxytocin. It also acts on smooth muscle. smooth muscle of the uterus to make the uterus contract. It works on the male reproductive tract as well by working on the vas deferens or the ductus deferens for ejaculation. So that's the hypothalamus. Now remember, the hypothalamus connects to the pituitary by way of the infundibulum. There is a connection there. And the pituitary has an anterior and a posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is referred to as the adenohypophysis, and the posterior lobe is called the neurohypophysis. And that's because there are these nerve-like or axons and neurological fibers that connect from the hypothalamus into the posterior lobe, so it's called the neurohypophysis. Remember that the pituitary sits in a groove called the sella turcica, also known as the hypophyseal fossa. Hypophyseal fossa is why we have an adenohypophysis and a neurohypophysis. Hypophysis is pituitary. So the anterior lobe has the majority of the hormones, whereas posterior lobe only has the job of releasing two, oxytocin and ADH, which remember were made in the hypothalamus. The anterior lobe, that's got a larger job to do. It releases adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, growth hormone, GH, prolactin, follicular stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and melanocyte stimulating hormone. Now, LH and FSH, follicular stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, these affect both male and female reproductive tract. They help with the production of the gamete, of the ovary and the egg and the sperm. Okay? Luteinizing hormone is what's measured in women's urine when a woman is pregnant. Right? There's a very narrow window that an egg can become fertilized in. It's like a 24-hour window at best, maybe 30 hours, maybe at best. And it's when ovulation takes place when luteinizing hormone is at its highest. So when luteinizing hormone is high, it means, okay, the ovary just pushed out an egg, it's ovulating, and the fimbriae of the fallopian tubes scooped it up, and now you have this egg that's in the fallopian tubes that's waiting to get fertilized there, somewhere there. And when it gets fertilized, the cilia that are in the uterine tube or fallopian tube will move that fertilized egg into the uterus for implantation. Okay? And I do go over that in my reproductive video, so please take the time to watch that. So there's the anterior lobe, there's the posterior lobe. We'll go over it in a little bit more detail. I have another visual of those. The thyroid gland is responsible for releasing T4 and T3, predominantly T4, which is thyroxine. T4, the T is for tyrosine, and the 4 is for how many iodines are attached to it. So if you have a tyrosine with 4 iodines, you have thyroxine. If you have a tyrosine with 3 iodines, it's called triiodothyronine. Usually, for the most part, T4 is converted into T3 in the liver. And that conversion requires selenium, a mineral selenium, to do it, but it takes place primarily in the liver. Calcitonin is another hormone that the thyroid gland releases, and calcitonin is a hormone that is involved in regulating calcium balance in your blood. If calcium levels get too high, then calcitonin is released by the thyroid, and it says, let's get rid of some of this calcium. So your body will find a way of driving some of it out of the blood into the bone, or it'll excrete some calcium through the urine, and it'll tell vitamin D to shut down and say, hey, we don't need to absorb more calcium from the digestive system. That's what the thyroid gland does in relationship to calcitonin. Now, calcitonin and the thyroid gland has a close relative over here called the parathyroid gland. And the parathyroid gland releases parathyroid hormone that's antagonistic to calcitonin. They're both calcium regulators, they just do the opposite thing. So calcitonin is designed to lower the amount of calcium in blood, whereas PTH, parathyroid hormone, is designed to increase the amount of calcium in the blood if it dips too low. It'll just pull it out of the bone. It'll turn on digestion and say, hey, vitamin D, let's absorb more calcium. And it'll tell the kidneys, hey, let's shut them down so we're not losing this mineral through the urine. The adrenal glands, I'll show you the adrenal gland shortly, but it has two parts, an adrenal medulla and an adrenal cortex. The word cortex means bark, not like a dog barking, but the bark of a tree. It's the outer protective covering. So the adrenal gland has a cortex, which is the outer portion. The adrenal medulla is the inner portion. The adrenal cortex produces cortisol, cortisone, corticosterone. These are called glucocorticoids. Cortisol and cortisone are glucocorticoids. And then it produces aldosterone, which is called a mineral corticoid. In the word mineral corticoid is the word mineral. So it's involved in trying to retain and hold on to a mineral called sodium. Aldosterone allows you to hold on to sodium. If you hold on to sodium, what's going the opposite way is potassium, because sodium and potassium move in opposite directions of one another. So aldosterone allows you to hold on to sodium, and if you hold on to sodium, you're holding on to water, right? Just think of eating salt or salty chips. After you have salty chips, you're thirsty. So you drink water and you retain the water. Androgens, these is like sex hormones, like testosterone is an androgen. The adrenal medulla produces catecholamines, and the two big catecholamines are epinephrine and norepinephrine. Those are the two biggies. Epinephrine is also known as adrenaline, and norepinephrine is known as noradrenaline. The adrenals are involved in especially the adrenal medulla, the fight or flight response, which is sympathetically controlled, which increases your heart rate, increases your breathing, dilates your pupils, right? Fight or flight response, sympathetics, is like you're in danger and you have to get out of danger's way. Okay, the adrenal glands are involved in when your body is under stress, your adrenal glands kick in to try and regulate that stress. And we'll show you how stress kills in just a few minutes. The pancreas, insulin and glucagon, I'll show you that shortly. That's the endocrine portion. The pineal gland up here, or the pineal gland, releases melatonin, which is involved with toning you down at night, helping you sleep, your biological clock. That's the pineal gland. Parathyroid, we mentioned. The heart. Well, I thought the heart is just part of the cardiovascular system. Well, it too can release hormones, and a biggie is ANP, which stands for atrial natriuretic peptide. Now, when you look at the word natriuretic, it sounds like a diuretic, but the first two letters are Na. Na is sodium. Natrium is sodium. So ANP, atrial natriuretic polypeptide, is antagonistic to aldosterone. Aldosterone is trying to hold on to and retain sodium, but then your blood pressure goes up. If your blood pressure goes up, then you have ANP that the heart says, hey, we got to lose some of this stuff. Let's get rid of the sodium. That's what AN is, atrial natriuretic polypeptide. Your thymus, which is deep to your sternum, it looks like the thyroid, but it's not. It's down here. That's your thymus. That tends to go through atrophy or wasting away during adulthood. It starts to increase in size when you're an infant and a child because you're being exposed to everything for the first time. So it's producing and allowing for T cells to mature. And so it secretes thymosins, which allows for T cell production and T cell maturation. Your fat cells or adipocytes or adipose tissue is going to secrete a few things. One is leptin, which is going to say, okay, you know, like we're full, we're done. There's fat in here, we're good. But adipose also releases cytokines. And cytokines can be both inflammatory and anti-inflammatory, but fat cells themselves secrete pro-inflammatory cytokines. So if you have some inflammatory disease like diabetes, MS, Parkinson's, cancer, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, you know, most diseases in the United States are inflammatory. That means that if you're obese or morbidly obese or overweight and you have an excessive amount of adipose, those adipose become metabolically active and release inflammatory or pro-inflammatory cytokines, which make any inflammatory condition worse. Even osteoporosis and osteopenia, they make that worse. The digestive tract secretes numerous hormones that are involved in regulating glucose metabolism and your appetite. Your kidneys, I said, are involved in increasing oxygenation because of this erythropoietin. Erythrocytes are your red blood cells. So the term erythropoietin means red blood cell production. So all the blood's going through the kidneys. Your kidneys go, hey, you know what? The amount of oxygen is a little bit low. Maybe the person's anemic. They need more oxygen for energy production. So the kidneys produce erythropoietin. This hormone goes to your bone marrow, and your bone marrow is going to push out more RBCs, more erythrocytes, more red blood cells, thinking, hey, the more red blood cells we have, the more cells that carry hemoglobin, the more potential cells we have to bind to oxygen. Then we have calcitriol, which is vitamin D. So the kidneys are also involved with vitamin D production. Then you have the gonads down at the bottom, the testes. The male are going to produce androgens, especially testosterone, and then the ovaries are going to produce estrogen and progesterone, or progestins. So I promised you that I was going to show you the another picture that shows the connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So you could see back here is the posterior pituitary. There's the division. Here is the adenohypophysis, or the anterior division, and here's the infundibulum. And you can see these are these connections, or there's neurological connections between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary, which is why it's called the neurohypophysis, and the anterior lobe is called the adenohypophysis. So The hypothalamus can release adrenocorticotropic hormone. And that ACTH goes to the adrenal gland, and you'll see that we have a cortex, which is the outer part, and the inside is the adrenal medulla. So adrenocorticotropic hormone, cortico for cortex, that's going to release cortisol primarily. But other glucocorticoids, cortisol, cortisone, corticosterone, those are the glucocorticoids. It can also stimulate the mineral corticoid, which is aldosterone. So that's connection from the pituitary to the cortex. And cortisol is going to increase your heart rate. And it's going to increase your cholesterol and increase your blood pressure, which is a fight or flight type of response. The sympathetic neural system has direct fibers going from the nervous system to the adrenal medulla. And that's where you have epinephrine and norepinephrine. Those are your catecholamines. Again, that's like adrenaline and noradrenaline. The posterior pituitary releases thyroid stimulating hormone that goes to the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland pushes out T4, thyroxine. T4 will get converted to T3, triiodothyronine. Again, that takes place in the liver, and it is selenium dependent, but the thyroid can push out T3 as well, just not as much as the liver can, okay? And that's going to regulate your metabolism. We all know people that have fast metabolism, hyperthyroidism, or a sluggish one, hypoactive thyroid. We know people that can eat and eat and eat, never put on a pound, and then we know people that just look at an ice cream sundae and gain 5 pounds, right? Okay, we have growth hormone, which goes to the liver and can produce somatomedins, and that's going to help to increase and rejuvenate your bone and your muscles and other tissues to help them grow. Growth hormone really does allow you to grow. We produce it at night. So especially around 40 to 50 minutes after you fall asleep, your body pushes out growth hormone. What blocks the growth hormone receptors is if you have a refined carbohydrate or something sweet or sugary before you go to bed, you defeat the whole purpose. So you may wake up in the morning not feeling rejuvenated and renewed. And it's because of you had a little cereal or a bowl of ice cream or a little cookie or a cake before you went to bed. That messes up the whole growth hormone. Then you have prolactin. Prolactin is pro-lactation, right? For lactation. So it's going to go to the mammary glands to produce milk. Then you have follicular stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. You can see that they both work synergistically together on both the testes and the ovaries. The testes are going to produce testosterone, and the ovaries are going to produce estrogen and progesterone. You need cholesterol for this, right? Testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, they're kind of steroid-based, which comes from cholesterol, sterone. Okay, so you do need cholesterol. That's why when people are on, especially guys, if they're on cholesterol medication, their libido goes down. And then they need erectile dysfunction medication because they don't have enough cholesterol to produce testosterone. The same company that makes the cholesterol drugs end up making Viagra, right? Because they know what the drugs are going to do, how it will adversely affect. I will also show you how stress, when you're under stress, your body can funnel all of its energy into producing cortisol, and we don't have enough to produce these sex hormones, which is one of the reasons why when you're under stress, infertility rates go up. It's hard for couples to get pregnant when they're under stress. Okay, then we have melanocyte stimulating hormone, which is involved with skin pigmentation. On the posterior pituitary, we have anti-diuretic. We spoke about that, as well as oxytocin. Oxytocin will make the smooth muscle of the uterus contract, as well as the vas deferens or the ductus deferens in the prostate gland during ejaculation. Up here are all the abbreviations that you can see what they stand for. If you want to revisit that, you certainly can. This slide here just shows the primary function of growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, FSH, LH, prolactin, adrenocorticotropic hormone. So if you need to review their primary functions, you can go back to the slide, pause it, and just review that on your own. Here's the oxytocin that we spoke about. It's involved with the smooth muscle around the breast tissue, around the uterus. ADH will affect anti-diuretic hormone holding on to water. So it's going to affect sweat glands, it's going to affect the kidneys, and even affect blood pressure by constricting or vasoconstricting the arterioles. Okay. In terms of hormones are going to work on a feedback loop, negative feedback and positive feedback. If you remember from the very beginning, we talked about negative feedback loops, which is when you have a particular condition, like someone just ate a meal loaded with sugar, had a Pepsi, had soda, had pasta, had bread, had fruit, had, just lots of food with sugar, and it goes up. Your body wants to lower it because all that sugar is toxic. It's toxic to the arteries, it's toxic to the eyes, the kidneys, and the neural system. So a negative feedback loop says, hey, blood sugar is really high, we got to dip it, we're going to use insulin. Or blood pressure is too high, we need to make it lower. Or blood pressure is too low, we need to make it higher. Or the respiratory rate is too low, we need to speed it up. So taking one condition and making the opposite is a negative feedback loop. Positive feedback loops, there's very few in the body, but the one that comes to mind and the biggie is labor. When a woman is having contractions, it's oxytocin that creates more pain, which creates more contraction, which creates more pain, and it creates more contractions. And it is a positive feedback loop, meaning more hormone, more contraction, more hormone, more pain. It keeps on happening more and more and more until the baby delivers. And that's the only time it ends up becoming a negative feedback loop, because the baby's delivered, we don't have more contractions anymore. Okay. Okay, the thyroid and parathyroid gland, what this is showing here is that, okay, we have high levels of calcium in the blood. That's going to stimulate the thyroid parafollicular cells to release calcitonin. Okay, when your body releases calcitonin, it's going to find a way to get rid of calcium. And one of the ways that it's going to get rid of calcium is that it's going to put calcium into the bone. It's going to tell the digestive tract, hey, let's not absorb more calcium. And it's going to tell the kidneys, let's get rid of some calcium. If your calcium levels dip too low and we need to increase the amount of calcium in the blood, then the body uses PTH, or parathyroid hormone. When your body releases PTH and we need to increase the amount of calcium in the bone, we need to increase the amount of calcium in your blood, then parathyroid hormone is going to activate the osteoclast. The osteoclast breaks down the calcium in the bone and it's going to increase the amount of calcium in your blood, raise it. It's going to go to the digestive tract and say, hey, vitamin D, let's absorb more calcium from the food. So again, rise calcium level. And then kidneys, besides producing vitamin D to allow the calcium absorption from the intestines, it's going to increase and reabsorb calcium so you're not peeing it out. we're urinating it out. So all different ways of raising calcium by parathyroid hormone. It breaks down the bone, increases calcium absorption using vitamin D the kidneys made, and shuts down the kidney from urinating it out and retains it. So that's the connection between thyroid and parathyroid. Thyroid uses calcitonin, it's going to bring calcium, put it in the bone. It's going to say digestion. We don't need to absorb anymore. And kidneys, let's get rid of calcium. Okay, let's look at the adrenal glands. We look at the adrenal glands, you can see the word renal, and the word renal means kidney. And whenever you see the prefix add, it means bringing something or adding something to kidneys. So that is the adrenal gland. When the adrenal gland, aka the suprarenal gland, which is here and here, we'll see that we have two main parts to the adrenal gland. We have the adrenal cortex on the outside, the adrenal medulla on the inside. What was it that the adrenal cortex produced? The adrenal cortex is going to produce the glucocorticoids and the mineral corticoids and the androgens, all in the cortex. So when we look at the cortex here, histologically, it's made up of these zones: the zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and the zona reticularis. These three regions are all part of the cortex. The medulla is here, deeper. So the zona glomerulosa is going to secrete the mineral corticoid, mostly aldosterone. The fasciculata is going to release the glucocorticoid, primarily cortisol. And then the zona reticularis, the deeper part of the cortex, just before you hit the medulla, that's going to produce the androgen, primarily testosterone. So again, the zona glomerulosa releases the mineral corticoid, aldosterone, the fasciculata, the glucocorticoid, cortisol, and then the zona reticularis, a weak androgen, testosterone. Now, I'm going to show you how aldosterone works, and I'm going to show you this renin angiotensin aldosterone system. Now, when we look at renin, right? What do we see here? We see renal, that's kidney. When we see angio refers to blood vessels. And then we see the word tensin, which looks like tension. So this is going to have something to do with the kidneys and something to do with the tension of blood vessels. And we know aldosterone is a mineral corticoid that's involved with sodium. Sodium, kidney, blood vessel tension. I'm thinking blood pressure. Okay, that's what comes to mind. So let's take a look at this renin angiotensin aldosterone pathway. In this particular instance, the person has low blood pressure. Maybe they're dehydrated. Maybe they're not consuming enough sodium or salt, or maybe they're losing blood. Maybe they're hemorrhaging. Either way, there's a decrease in the blood volume, which means there's a decrease in blood pressure. Now, all the blood is going into the kidneys, and the kidneys, at the level of the nephron, that functional unit of the kidney, there's a particular part called the juxtaposition apparatus of the kidneys that are saying, hey, blood pressure is too low. We're going to release a hormone that's going to get the ball rolling to try and increase the pressure. So it's going to release renin. So the kidneys, which is renal, is going to release this hormone called renin. Now, what is renin's job? Renin's job is that it's going to bump into something that the liver made. The liver made something called Angiotensinogen. Now, when we look at Angiotensinogen, let's just take a look and see angio, again, blood vessel, tension, but what is ogen? Ogen means it's inactive. It's an inactive enzyme. So when renin bumps into this angiotensinogen, it's going to activate it. It's going to turn angiotensinogen, which is inactive, into angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1. Now, if there's an angiotensin 1, we know that there's going to be an angiotensin 2. What is going to convert angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2 is an enzyme that the lungs make called ACE. And ACE stands for angiotensin converting enzyme. So angiotensin converting enzyme is simply going to convert angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. What is angiotensin 2 going to do? This right here, this angiotensin 2 has a major job to do. It's going to increase your blood pressure. How is it going to increase your blood pressure? A few ways. It is going to go to the adrenal cortex. It's going to push out aldosterone. Aldosterone says, hey, we're going to hold on to sodium. And when I'm holding on to sodium, I'm going to hold on to water. If I'm holding on to sodium and to water, look what happens. The blood volume goes up, which is going to increase your blood pressure. And your blood pressure is restored to normal. Angiotensin 2 is also responsible for constricting your arteries. If you constrict an artery, blood pressure goes up. So this is the RAS system, the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. It ensures that there's always volume of blood and blood pressure to drive blood into the kidneys. If not, the kidneys are involved, not just the kidneys, but the lungs, right? You've got lungs and kidneys that are involved in regulating blood pressure, as well as the liver, major players to regulate it. So you have to have people with healthy liver, and what people put in their bodies puts a lot of pressure on the liver to cleanse it and purify it and clean it out. So I believe we see a lot of blood pressure dysregulation, primarily because of kidneys, and most people may not be working too well. The liver's been under stress, which is a major filter to detox the body. Air quality, the lungs aren't the best. And I think the end organ, which is the heart, is the last one that takes the hit that shows the dysfunction. Is the problem really the pressure, or is that just a symptom? And the problem comes from all these other avenues like kidneys and liver and lungs. Let me show you how stress kills. So now you have a person under short-term stress on the left-hand side. This path does not take the pituitary gland. This goes right from the hypothalamus, and there are these ganglionic or preganglionic neurons that go right into the spinal cord, and from the spinal cord right into the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla has the catecholamines, adrenaline and noradrenaline, which are going to increase your heart rate, increase your blood pressure, increase blood sugar, increase your cholesterol, right? That's short term, no problem. But what happens when this becomes more prolonged? It's not short-term stress. Now you got school, you got relationship problems. Did you pay the mortgage, the rent, the cell phone? I got class. Oh my God, there's so much work to do. That's prolonged stress. Now we have the hypothalamus sending signals to the anterior pituitary. You have adrenocorticotropic hormones sending and branching out to the adrenal cortex. That's going to push out glucocorticoids and mineral corticoids. The mineral corticoid is aldosterone. That's going to retain sodium and water, which increases blood pressure. Glucocorticoids are going to increase your blood sugar. It's going to suppress your immune system. Cortisol is going to increase your heart rate. So if you have high blood pressure, high cholesterol, high blood sugar for a prolonged period of time, can you understand how and why stress kills, and people have strokes and heart attacks when they're under stress? The pancreas, okay, the pancreas is a mixed gland because it has endocrine and exocrine function. The digestive enzymes are exocrine. Most of the exocrine cells are arranged in these little clusters called acini or acinar cells, and that's the exocrine portion, whereas the endocrine tissue has these pancreatic islets, okay? And the islets are made up of alpha cells, beta cells, delta cells, and F cells. So the alpha cells produce glucagon to increase blood sugar. The beta cells release insulin to decrease blood sugar. So you can see down here you have these are little acinars, okay, or an acinus is one of these here, right? So these are more exocrine function. Endocrine is more internal over here. We have alpha, beta, and delta cells. The F cells are going to release these pancreatic polypeptide like pancreatic lipase and carbohydrase and protease to break down fats, carbs, and proteins. In terms of insulin, if you have, let's say, an imbalance to your blood sugar and you have high blood sugar, the pancreas, especially the beta cells, release insulin. And insulin is going to drive blood sugar into the liver, and it's going to store it as glycogen, or it's going to drive it into this. It's going to drive glucose uptake by your cells. If your cells are taking up glucose, or glucose has now entered the liver in an inactive form called glycogen, the amount of sugar in your bloodstream goes down. That's how you lower blood sugar. So now your blood glucose falls back to normal. If it dips too low and you have a decrease in blood glucose, the pancreas releases, at least the alpha cells of it, release glucagon. That goes to the liver, and it tells the stored form of glucose called glycogen to turn into glucose, at which point glucose levels rise. So you have this seesaw of insulin and glucagon working against one another. When the blood sugar is dysregulated, or you have a hyposecretion of insulin or a hypoactivity of insulin, people get what we call the 3 Ps: polyuria, polydipsia, and polyphagia. Polyuria is they're peeing a lot. There's lots of urination to try and get the excess glucose out of the body. There's polydipsia. It's a little typo. It should be a Y here. Polydipsia, which is increased thirst. Well, because they're urinating so much, they're getting so thirsty. And polyphagia, excessive hunger, because they're not using glucose properly. Their body's going to try and use fat for energy. Okay. Hyperinsulinism is when there's an excessive amount of insulin secretion, and that results in hypoglycemia, which is too little blood sugar. That can happen if someone's not watching their insulin levels and they inject insulin when they don't need it. They can go into a hypoglycemic effect. Okay, the ovaries produce estrogen and progesterone together with the gonadotropic hormones of the anterior pituitary. It's going to regulate female reproductive cycle. It's going to help to maintain a pregnancy. It's going to prepare the mammary glands for milk production or lactation. Okay, testosterone is going to stimulate the descent of the testes before birth. It's involved with regulating sperm production and promoting the development of the secondary sex characteristics of the male. Okay, there is inhibin, which sounds like to inhibit, which inhibits the secretion of FSH from the pituitary for both the male and the female. Both have inhibin, which pretty much does the same thing. Relaxin is going to increase the flexibility of the pubic symphysis during pregnancy, right? Because the whole pelvic innominate bones is going to expand so the baby can fit properly in that pelvic inlet and expand and open. So it's going to relax all of the ligaments to allow an easier labor. Okay, some miscellaneous hormones. Like to talk about icosanoids, and these are local hormones that are involved with inflammation. Okay, the leukotrienes and prostaglandins are two biggies. The leukotrienes are going to influence white blood cells and inflammation. Your prostaglandins are going to be involved with smooth muscle contraction. Think of a woman during that time of month when the menstrual cramps happen. There's smooth muscle contraction. And what can a woman take is going to be ibuprofen or a prostaglandin blocker, which stops the smooth muscle contraction. Prostaglandins are also involved in increasing fever. So a prostaglandin blocker can lower fever. Prostaglandins are involved in producing mucus in the stomach. Mucus is needed to protect the lining of the stomach. So if someone takes an aspirin, the fever can go down. Smooth muscle contraction of the uterus, that can ease up. But people take aspirin, they can get an ulcer in the stomach because it blocks the mucus protection of the lining of the stomach, and now you just have stomach acids that start to erode the stomach away. So prostaglandins are really important. The ibuprofen and other NSAIDs, NSAIDs stand for non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs that treat pain, fever, and inflammation. They're all basically prostaglandin inhibitors or blockers. So the prostaglandins come from a precursor that you see up here called arachidonic acid. Arachidonic acid is in all of your cell membrane walls, all of them. If you have too much arachidonic acid, that is the precursor to prostaglandins. The more arachidonic acid, the more prostaglandins you can produce, which means more pain, inflammation, and swelling. And that's where aspirin and ibuprofen come in. These are these COX-1 blockers and COX-2 inhibitors also. Okay. The COX just stands for cyclogenase. That's an enzyme that converts arachidonic acid into prostaglandins. So aspirin is an enzyme blocker. It's blocking the COX-1 or COX-2 enzymes here. From arachidonic acid, you also get the leukotrienes. And here was the COX enzyme, here is the LOX, lipoxygenase. So there are LOX inhibitors that block leukotriene production. When leukotrienes are produced, you get bronchoconstriction, you get airway obstruction, You get like asthma-like symptoms, that wheezing. So when I think of leukotrienes, I'm thinking more of airway constriction. When I'm thinking prostaglandins, I'm thinking more pain, inflammation, and swelling. Right? This is where someone has arthritis symptoms or fever, general musculoskeletal pain syndromes are going to involve this pathway here. So inflammation is made in response to tissue damage, right? When a tissue gets damaged, the body releases something called bradykinin. And bradykinin is this chemical messenger that's going to bind to a G-reactive protein, which stimulates this phospholipase A1. Now remember, a cell membrane is made up of phospholipids. So phospholipase is going to break down the phospholipid layer, causing the release of what is contained within it called arachidonic acid. And that arachidonic acid is the precursor, as we said, to both prostaglandins and leukotrienes. Arachidonic acid is found in peanuts, it's found in fried foods, it's found in shellfish, is really high in arachidonic acid. It's in the standard American diet, arachidonic acid is in quite a few foods, especially shellfish, peanuts, very inflammatory as well. So the answer to how aspirin or ibuprofen works, it was discovered in 1971, and it inhibits the key enzyme in the prostaglandin synthesis without affecting the leukotriene pathway. And it can treat a variety of conditions, like we said before, like RA, rheumatoid arthritis. The usefulness of aspirin to treat fever and pain implies that prostaglandins are responsible for those type of symptoms. Just have to be very, very careful with overusing aspirin. Because aspirin is also a blood thinner, right? It inhibits platelets, so you won't clot as well. Just a few neat pictures to show you certain things that you may have seen in terms of too much growth hormone, right? You can have conditions here like giantism, where the growth hormone is making this gentleman grow excessively tall. Over here, when it happens in an adult, you get this like caveman, Neanderthalish, like thick skull, thick eyebrows. It's called acromegalia. So when you have too much growth hormone in an adult, we call it acromegalia. And when it happens in someone younger, it's called giantism. Here is a goiter, which is an enlargement of the thyroid gland. Here in hyperthyroidism, there's a condition called exophthalmos, where it looks like the eyes are protruding forward. You can see the white of the eyes all the way around, which you typically don't see in an average person's eye. So this is a sign of a hyperactive thyroid as seen with Graves' disease. And here is Cushing's syndrome. We have the reddening and the round moon-like face that is seen from an excessive amount of glucocorticoids like cortisol. Here is the exophthalmos, just another look of the protrusion of the eyes. Here is Cushing's syndrome, which is where you have that glucocorticoid, whether it's exogenously or endogenously released. You get thin skin, you get this round moon face, you get very, very red cheeks, you get this buffalo hump here, you get these reddish purple striations with a round pendulous belly, and you get thinner legs. So it's like you're thicker up here and a little bit thinner down here. The wounds take a long time for it to heal. You get high blood pressure because of the cortisol push, and you have a little bit thinner skin. Okay, this is what it looks like. You have that round face. The cheeks don't look too red, but here you have the moon face. You can see the purple striae. It looks like stretch marks here. Purple striae, the striations, and then you get that buffalo hump here, that fat pad at the base of the neck. The only other time I really see this is also in pre-diabetics. You get that buffalo hump here as a pre-diabetic.